The afternoon sun hung lazily over the village of St. Giles, casting long honey-gold streaks across the churchyard and the manicured lawns of Colonel and Mrs. Havisham's estate. It was one of those rare, untroubled English afternoons, the kind that seemed perfectly designed for lemonade, gossip, and unspoken rivalry. The Havisham's annual garden party had become a fixture of village life, a tradition as dependable as the vicar's sermons or Mrs. Croft's complaints about modern bread. By 4 o'clock, most of the village had gathered. Ladies in pastel hats, men pretending they weren't sweating in their summer suits, and a scattering of wide-eyed children hoping for sponge cake. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her soft grey lace and carrying her parasol, sat quietly at a small wrought-iron table near the hydrangeas. She had been invited, as she always was, more out of social obligation than expectation of entertainment. She preferred to listen rather than speak. A garden party, she often said, was the perfect place to observe human nature. It required very little effort for people to reveal themselves. From her vantage point, Miss Marple watched as conversation flowed like polite wine. Mrs. Pennington was complaining about the new postman, who, according to her, looked far too young to be trustworthy. Young Alice Dunning was laughing with a little too much enthusiasm at the jokes of Dr. Leonard Graves, a widower whose reputation for charm had not gone unnoticed. And near the rose trellis stood Mr. Alfred Cotter, the local banker, whose stiff collar and stiffer manner betrayed a man unaccustomed to relaxation. Everything was proceeding as it always did, until it wasn't. At precisely 4:15, the laughter faltered. A strange sound rippled through the crowd. Not a shout, not a scream, but something sharp and startled, like the snapping of a thread, is Havisham. Ever the hostess stood frozen beside the tea table, her hand trembling slightly as she pointed toward the croquet lawn. There, beneath the dappled shade of a chestnut tree, lay a man motionless on the grass. His cup of tea had spilled beside him, staining the pristine white of his shirt. It was Mr. Alfred Cotter. Dr. Graves was the first to move, rushing to the scene with practiced urgency. A small crowd gathered behind him, hesitant, whispering, already afraid of what they might discover. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, her calm eyes fixed on the scene. She did not rush forward. There was no need. Panic, she knew, would reveal more than patience ever could. From her distance, she noted small things, the way Mrs. Pennington clutched her handbag so tightly that her knuckles whitened, the faint, almost imperceptible nod exchanged between Alice Dunning and the vicar's wife, and the curious stillness of the butler, who had paused halfway down the terrace steps, tray still in hand. After a moment, Dr. Graves rose from beside the fallen man. His face was grave. "He's dead," he announced quietly. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of parasols, the orchestra of shock that always followed death in a village unaccustomed to it. Mrs. Havisham swayed slightly and was escorted indoors by her husband. Someone muttered about fainting salts. Someone else whispered that it must have been his heart. And Miss Marple at last rose to her feet. She walked toward the crowd with her usual unhurried grace, stopping just before the circle that had formed around the body. "Such a pity," she murmured softly. "Poor Mr. Cotter. He never could take his tea without 3 spoons of sugar, I recall." Dr. Graves glanced at her briefly, distracted by his own inspection. Yes, tragic. Must be the heat, I imagine." Miss Marple's gaze, however, was not on the doctor. It lingered on the teacup. Its rim was oddly stained, not brown as one might expect from tea, but something faintly bluish, almost metallic in hue. "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "The heat does make one quite careless, doesn't it?" And then she noticed it, the smallest thing. A detail anyone else would have missed. A honeybee, lifeless, floating in the spilled tea. By evening, word had spread across the entire village. Mr. Alfred Cotter, manager of the local branch of Lloyd's Bank, had died suddenly at the Havisham's garden party. A respectable man, though not universally liked. Some whispered that it was his heart, others that he had been drinking secretly. Mrs. Pennington swore she saw him clutch his chest before collapsing, and young Alice Dunning insisted he had been pale all morning. The constable arrived from Much Benham by bicycle and began asking awkward questions between apologies. By dusk, the lawn had been cleared, and the guests had departed, some shaken, others animated by the thrill of it all. Miss Marple returned home to her small, ivy-covered cottage on Church Lane. She brewed herself a quiet cup of tea without sugar and sat by the window as twilight deepened over St. Giles. She did not believe it had been the heat, nor the heart, nor the tea. No, she thought gently, setting down her cup. It had been something far more deliberate and far more human outside. The village bells began to toll for evening service, but in Miss Marple's mind, they tolled for something else entirely. The beginning of a mystery that would test every quiet truth she had ever known about her neighbors. The following morning dawned pale and cool, a thin mist curling over the cobblestones of St. Giles, like breath from a whispering mouth. The tranquility of dawn was deceptive, because beneath it the village pulsed with quiet unrest. Word of Mr. Alfred Cotter's sudden death had spread faster than the Morning Post, finding its way into every breakfast table conversation and every half-opened window. The Havisham's garden, once the pride of summer hospitality, had become a place of hushed speculation. At the bakery, Mrs. Pennington held court with a kind of tragic authority, retelling her version of events with ever-growing dramatic flair. She described how poor Mr. Cotter had turned quite blue about the lips before collapsing, a detail which seemed to grow more vivid each time she repeated it. Others nodded solemnly, grateful to be included in something thrilling for once in their quiet lives. Across the counter, Mrs. Blythe, the baker's wife, offered the opinion that it must have been the sugar, since she'd always suspected refined sugar to be bad for the heart. Meanwhile, Constable Evans, perspiring in his too-tight uniform, went door to door with his notebook, knocking politely and asking questions that led nowhere. He had declared it natural causes for now, though he admitted privately to the vicar that Miss Marple gave me a funny look when I said that. At her cottage, Miss Marple was already 2 steps ahead of the village gossip. She had taken her morning tea while reading the previous day's newspaper, though the words hardly registered. Her mind kept returning to the blue-tinged tea and the single dead bee floating within it. She recalled the faint metallic sheen, a residue she'd seen once before in her youth, when an unfortunate neighbour in St. Mary Mead had died after swallowing a tonic meant for her roses. When Colonel Havisham appeared at her gate just before 10, his face drawn and his hat clutched nervously. She wasn't surprised. "My dear Miss Marple," he began, clearing his throat, "I hardly know what to make of all this. Dr. Graves insists the man's heart failed him, but Mrs. Havisham's quite beside herself. She insists something dreadful must have happened. You were there, weren't you? You saw him." "I did indeed," said Miss Marple softly, motioning for him to sit on the bench by her lilac bush. "And I must confess, Colonel, I found the circumstances rather irregular." The Colonel frowned. "Irregular?" She nodded. "You see, heart failure doesn't often come so tidily. Mr. Cotter appeared perfectly well until he drank his tea. Then almost instantly he faltered. The timing seems peculiar, does it not?" He blinked, digesting her words. "You mean poison?" "I wouldn't like to use such an unpleasant term without cause," she said, stirring her own cup delicately. "But if one wished to conceal a misdeed, tea would be a convenient vehicle." "Few beverages inspire such unguarded trust." The Colonel shifted uneasily. "Good Lord. You think someone at our party might have done this deliberately?" Miss Marple's eyes met his with quiet gravity. "Colonel, crimes are seldom committed by strangers in our sort of village. They are, I'm afraid, the product of very familiar faces." Before he could reply, a brisk knock sounded at the gate. It was Dr. Graves, looking harried but dignified. "Ah, there you are, Havisham," he said. "Terrible business, terrible. I've just spoken to the coroner in Much Benham. They'll want to perform an examination after all. Seems there are inconsistencies." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Inconsistencies?" Graves hesitated. "Yes, the discoloration of the lips, for one. And I can't quite explain the faint scent about his breath. Bitter, rather like almonds." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she felt her suspicions quietly confirm themselves. "Bitter almonds, cyanide, it was an old poison, unfashionable but effective." "How dreadful," murmured the Colonel. "But surely, Doctor, how could such a thing come to pass?" "Carter was a careful man." "Careful, yes," Graves said, "but not universally loved. He'd denied 3 loans this month alone. One to the vicar's nephew, one to young Alice Dunning's father, and another rather discreetly to Mrs. Pennington's cousin." Money troubles always stir resentment. Miss Marple absorbed this without comment, her mind already weaving threads together. Money, tea, bitterness, resentment. The pattern, faint though it was, had begun to form its outline. That afternoon, she took her customary walk through the village. The air smelled of damp stone and cut grass, and everywhere she went, conversation faltered when she passed. Near the green, she encountered Alice Dunning herself, dressed in mourning black that seemed a little too soon, a little too practiced. "Oh, Miss Marple," Alice exclaimed. "Isn't it dreadful? Poor Mr. Cotter. He was so kind to me, helped me open my account, you know. Such a dear man." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Indeed, my dear, and I dare say you were grateful, though I couldn't help but notice how pale you were yesterday. You'd not been feeling unwell, I hope?" Alice's hands fluttered. "Oh, no, just the heat, I think. I hadn't eaten since breakfast." Miss Marple nodded slowly, watching her eyes. "Yes, the heat does take it out of one. Still, you mustn't skip your meals. Faintness can make people do odd things without meaning to." Alice blinked, uncertain whether she was being comforted or cautioned. By the time she thought of a reply, Miss Marple had already moved on toward the vicarage. There she found Mrs. Linton, the vicar's wife, arranging flowers for Sunday service. She was a nervous woman who always seemed on the verge of apology. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all anyone can talk about," she said, twisting her handkerchief. "You know, I saw Mr. Cotter talking quite sternly with someone just before it happened. I couldn't see who it was behind the tea tent, but he was rather agitated, shaking his hand at them." Miss Marple's eyes warmed. "How very interesting. You have such an eye for detail, my dear. Did you happen to notice the color of the other person's hat?" Mrs. Linton thought hard. "Blue, I think. Yes, a blue hat." That evening, as dusk fell over St. Giles once again, Miss Marple sat before her fire, the faint crackle of the logs punctuating her thoughts. She had seen 2 blue hats yesterday, one worn by Mrs. Pennington, another by the Havisham's maid Clara. Both women had been near the tea table. Both had poured cups for the guests. She leaned back, fingers lightly resting against her chin. The poison, she reasoned, must have entered the cup at the very moment of serving. Whoever had offered Mr. Cotter his tea had either meant to kill him or someone else entirely. Outside, the mist began to gather again, wrapping the village in a hush. The murder that had slept in silence was beginning at last to whisper. The following day brought rain, thin, persistent, and curiously gentle, like a secret unwilling to stay buried. Miss Marple, wrapped in her pale blue shawl, watched droplets crawl down her window pane as the bells of St. Giles tolled 10. The village, usually so brisk in its morning routine, seemed quieter now, as if it too were reflecting on what had transpired at the Havisham's garden. Death had a way of stilling gossip for a time, but only for a time. At 10:30, Constable Evans appeared again, knocking awkwardly on Miss Marple's door. He removed his hat with visible relief when she invited him in for tea. "Terrible business, ma'am," he sighed. "The coroner's confirmed it, cyanide. No doubt about it. Must have been slipped into his cup at the garden party." Miss Marple poured him tea with delicate precision. "Such things are usually very deliberate, Constable. Tell me, was there any sign of how it might have been administered? Powder, perhaps?" He scratched his head. "They think it was liquid, maybe in the sugar. But it's the oddest thing, his sugar bowl was shared, see? 3 people helped themselves before he did, and they're all perfectly well." Her eyes softened in interest. 3 people, you say? And who were they?" "Mrs. Pennington, Alice Dunning, and the maid, Clara. All had their cups from the same bowl, but only Mr. Cotter ended up dead. The doctor says it must have been something put in after he poured." Miss Marple stirred her own cup thoughtfully. "Yes, that seems most likely. The poisoner would have needed a quiet moment, a few seconds when Mr. Cotter's attention was elsewhere." Evans nodded earnestly. "Mrs. Havisham said she turned to greet the vicar just before the poor fellow drank. She can't recall who was standing nearest him then." "How inconvenient," murmured Miss Marple, though her eyes glimmered faintly. "And yet, quite convenient for someone else, don't you think?" The constable frowned. "Meaning, ma'am?" "Oh, nothing of consequence," she said lightly. "Only the tea parties have their own peculiar choreography. People drift, pass cups, exchange pleasantries. It's so easy to lose track of who's where. But a careful observer might notice patterns others miss." Evans looked as if he wanted to ask more, But she had already changed the subject to scones. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the Havishams once more, under the pretext of returning a handkerchief. The servants were subdued, whispering in corners. Clara, the young maid in question, looked pale and distracted, wringing her hands as she opened the door. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said softly, "I don't know what to think anymore. Everyone's talking about poison, but I swear I didn't touch his cup after I poured the tea." Miss Marple's voice was kind. "I don't doubt you, my dear, but tell me, did you notice anyone lingering near Mr. Cotter's table after you served him?" Clara frowned, searching her memory. "Well, Mrs. Pennington came to fetch another spoon, I think, and young Miss Alice was talking to him, though it didn't seem friendly. He looked rather cross. I didn't hear what was said." "Very good," Miss Marple murmured. "And tell me, did you happen to notice where the sugar tongs were when you left the tray?" Clara blinked. "The tongs?" "Why, on the bowl, of course. I set them there myself." "Ah," said Miss Marple quietly. "So you did." She thanked the girl and moved on, her mind already sorting the pieces like lacework. If the sugar had not been poisoned, and the tea itself untouched until poured, then the act must have been precise, added at the moment of serving, or in the stir. She thought again of the blue hats, of Mrs. Linton's recollection, and of the faint nod between Alice Dunning and the vicar's wife the previous day. It had not been accidental, that shared glance. It had been the silent recognition of a secret. She decided her next visit should be to Dr. Graves. The man had been first to reach the body, first to declare the heart, and first to speak of the almond scent. His professional confidence had an almost rehearsed quality to it, and that, Miss Marple found, was worth investigating. The doctor's house sat just beyond the square, its garden fragrant with foxglove and rosemary. He greeted her warmly, though surprise flickered behind his spectacles. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure. I assume you've come to ease my conscience. I can assure you the poor man was dead before I could lift a finger." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And what a comfort it must be to the village to have such a capable doctor. Though I confess I wonder, how did you happen to have the coroner summoned so swiftly?" Graves chuckled. "Professional instinct, my dear lady. I've seen enough oddities in my time to know when something isn't quite right. Besides, Cotter had that blue tinge, textbook cyanide. I smelled it immediately." "Did you now?" she said gently. "How fortunate. Most people would not have noticed such a thing outdoors, with so many scents in the air. Lilac tea, pastries." For a fraction of a second he hesitated. "Ah yes, perhaps my imagination then." "Perhaps," she agreed with a faint smile. "Still, it was quite astute of you. And I suppose you examined his hands too?" "Yes," he said quickly. No signs of struggle. Nothing under the nails. "Quite a tidy death." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite tidy indeed." As she took her leave, the faintest tremor crossed his fingers. She noticed it, of course. Miss Marple noticed everything, but she said nothing. She walked home in the thinning rain, her shoes tapping softly on the wet stones. By evening, her conclusions had begun to take shape. Someone had poisoned Mr. Cotter deliberately, but the method was not crude. The killer had planned for opportunity, a moment when the victim was distracted, when attention shifted elsewhere. Someone confident enough to act unnoticed in company, yet cautious enough to feign shock. She poured herself another cup of tea, her lips curving in mild amusement at the irony. "It's always tea," she murmured. So simple, so civilized, and yet so convenient for murder. Her mind drifted again to the bee, the one found in the spilled cup. It had not died of poison, she realized. Bees were sensitive creatures, but rarely succumbed to such compounds so instantly. No, it must have fallen into the tea after the man collapsed, which meant that when she saw the cup, it had already been moved. Someone had tampered with the scene after death. Miss Marple set down her cup and folded her hands. The question was no longer merely who had poisoned Alfred Cotter, but who had something to gain from the deception that followed. The answer, she suspected, would lie not in money alone, but in the peculiar habits of the human heart. Outside, the rain eased into silence, and the village of St. Giles slept uneasily under its shroud of secrets. The morning that followed was brighter, yet the village still seemed cloaked in unease. The rain had left the air clean and sharp, but conversation remained heavy with suspicion. Every shopkeeper, every gardener, every housemaid now had an opinion about who had poisoned Mr. Cotter. Yet beneath the chatter, Miss Marple sensed something else. Fear. Not the thrilling kind that accompanies gossip, but the quiet, guilty sort that clings to conscience. Miss Marple took her walk toward the square precisely at 9, parasol in hand and expression mild as ever. The baker's wife greeted her eagerly from the doorway. "Have you heard, Miss Marple? They've decided to keep the body another day. The coroner says there's confusion about the exact time of death. Can you imagine such a thing?" "Oh, quite," said Miss Marple pleasantly, though confusion is rather common when people are too eager to make sense of tragedy. Things are always clearer when one allows them to settle. From the bakery she continued toward the bank, the late Mr. Cotter's domain. The door, draped in black crepe, stood closed to the public, but through the window Miss Marple could see 2 clerks sorting ledgers. Money, she thought. It always lay somewhere near the motive, whether it appeared to or not. At the corner she found Alice Dunning again, this time without her composure. The young woman's face was pale, her eyes rimmed red. "Miss Marple," she said almost pleadingly, "you don't think I had anything to do with it, do you? Everyone's whispering that I argued with him." "Whispering?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I should think it's rather more than whispering by now. But arguments are ordinary things, my dear. They don't often end in murder, unless there's something worth killing for. Tell me, what did you quarrel about?" Alice looked around quickly, lowering her voice. He threatened my father. Said he'd call in the loan if we didn't pay by the end of the week. We'd lose the cottage, Miss Marple, everything. But I swear I didn't touch him. I only begged him to give us time." "I see," Miss Marple said softly. "And did he agree?" "No," Alice whispered. "He just smiled. That horrible, smug smile. Said he didn't forgive debts or people." Miss Marple nodded with a kindness that seemed to calm the girl. "You poor child. I dare say he's not the first man to make enemies through money. And yet it seems odd, doesn't it, that someone would go to such lengths to silence him entirely." Alice frowned. "You think it was someone else, then?" Miss Marple's parasol turned lightly in her hands. "My dear, in my experience, those who most desire to appear innocent are seldom the guiltiest. Still, it's rather curious. You say he threatened your father, but I'm told your father and Mr. Cotter played whist together on Fridays. Hardly the behavior of 2 men at odds." The girl blinked in confusion, color rising in her cheeks. I didn't know about that." "No, I imagine you didn't." Miss Marple left her with a gentle smile, but her mind was turning rapidly. Alice's father might have more to do with the affair than appeared, though she doubted the young woman's involvement. What interested her more was the inconsistency in how the scene of death had been handled. Someone had moved the teacup, she was certain of it, and only someone who had reason to obscure the evidence would have dared such a risk. She found Constable Evans at the vicarage gate, notebook in hand, looking puzzled. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed. "Glad to see you. I've been round the Havishams again asking about that cup. Nobody admits to touching it after Cotter fell, but the maid says she saw Dr. Graves pick it up when he examined the body." "How conscientious of him," Miss Marple said. "And did he return it to its place?" "That's just it. No one seems to recall. Mrs. Havisham says it was moved to the table by the time the constable from Much Benham arrived, which means," Miss Marple murmured, "that the evidence was handled before the authorities arrived." "Very inconvenient," Evans sighed. "He's a doctor, after all. Thought he was helping, maybe." "Perhaps," she said, though the word carried doubt. "Doctors are quite accustomed to precision. It's unlike them to make careless errors, especially when they know poison may be involved." As she walked home later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on Dr. Graves's composure. There had been something too smooth about his explanation, too prepared. And yet, something else nagged her. The way Mrs. Pennington had hovered during the tea service, always inserting herself into the conversation, always with a reason to fetch or carry. For a woman so fond of appearances, her eagerness to be seen might have been deliberate misdirection. When evening fell, Miss Marple lit a single lamp and took out her notebook. She did not write names, only initials and small marks, a code of her own devising. Each represented motive, opportunity, and temperament. By candlelight, the pattern slowly took shape. There were, she concluded, 3 distinct motives: money, humiliation, and concealment. Mr. Cotter had power over all 3. Alice's family was indebted to him. Dr. Graves had once been publicly rebuked by him at the club for a late payment, and Mrs. Pennington's cousin the one denied a loan, had recently been discovered falsifying accounts under her name. That connection, Miss Marple thought, was far too neat to ignore. She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly. If Mrs. Pennington's cousin stood to be exposed, perhaps the good lady had acted not for herself, but to protect her family's reputation. That would explain her presence near the tea table, her nervous retelling, her insistence on the story of blue lips, as though rehearsed. Yet it still did not explain why the cup had been tampered with after death, unless Miss Marple rose, crossing to her window where moonlight spilled faintly over the hedgerows. She recalled the bee again, the one in the tea. If Dr. Graves had lifted the cup, perhaps he had noticed something incriminating inside, something that should not have been there. He might have emptied and refilled it to erase that trace, ensuring no one questioned his role further. Or perhaps, she thought shrewdly, he had not wanted the poison identified too quickly. Ere delay in the coroner's certainty might serve him well if he had his own debts to hide. The thought settled in her mind like dust on porcelain, quiet, undeniable and faintly grim. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay Mrs. Havisham another visit. Not to speak of the party itself, but of her guest list. There was still one person she had not accounted for, one guest who had arrived uninvited and left without notice. And in Miss Marple's experience, it was often the unexpected presence that revealed the truth of what had been carefully hidden. As she extinguished the lamp, the faintest sound of church bells drifted through the night, solemn and slow. Somewhere in St. Giles, conscience was stirring, uneasy, restless, and afraid of what the morning might bring. The morning after the inquest dawned grey and wind-stirred, the kind of weather that seemed to echo unease. In St. Mary Mead, people spoke in whispers, their curiosity sharpened by the unanswered questions surrounding Henry Latimer's death. The official verdict was still uncertain, further inquiry required, but the village, as ever, had already drawn its own conclusions. Some said it was suicide from guilt, others whispered of foul play. Only one person kept her thoughts folded neatly away. Behind calm blue eyes and a serene smile, Miss Marple. She sat by her parlor window that morning, knitting a complicated pattern that demanded both patience and attention, two things she possessed in abundance. But her mind, as usual, was elsewhere. Every word from the inquest replayed in her thoughts, the coroner's dry tone, the doctor's report, and most of all, the small tremor in Mrs. Latimer's voice when she'd spoken of her husband's odd mood of late. It had not been sorrow she'd heard there, nor even fear. It was something else, something Miss Marple had seen before in a young bride long ago who'd been far too eager to weep in public and not nearly so grieved in private. A knock came at her door. She set her knitting down and rose, smoothing her dress before opening it to find Colonel Melrose standing on her step, his expression caught between irritation and reluctant respect. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "Thought I'd better have a word. You've a knack for seeing what others miss." "Oh dear," she said mildly. "I do hope it's not something dreadful again." The colonel stepped inside. "It's dreadful enough. Latimer's will has turned up. It seems he left the bulk of his estate to a Miss Evelyn Hartwell, his secretary. The widow gets very little." Miss Marple's brows lifted just slightly. "How extraordinary. Though, of course, men do make odd arrangements when they think they are dying, or perhaps when they have been persuaded they soon shall." The colonel blinked. "You think she, Mrs. Latimer?" "Oh, I think nothing, Colonel. Thinking too soon clouds one's vision. But I did happen to recall that Evelyn Hartwell left the village rather suddenly last evening. Did she not?" He frowned. "Took the late train. Said she was too upset to stay." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple murmured. "Though it is a curious thing, don't you think, that she packed before the inquest concluded? One might imagine she knew the outcome." The colonel's frown deepened. "You mean she's guilty?" "I mean," Miss Marple said gently, "that people in grief rarely plan ahead with such precision. But we mustn't overlook another possibility, that her departure was arranged for her convenience by someone else." The colonel sighed, defeated. "You always talk in riddles." "Only until the picture is clear," she said, smiling. "Might I ask a small favor?" "I'd like to speak with your constable. Young Pierce, isn't it? I believe he mentioned something about a broken cufflink found by the window near Mr. Latimer's desk." He blinked. "How did you—" "Good heavens, woman. You could run Scotland Yard if you wanted." "Oh no," Miss Marple said modestly. But one hears things, you know, and one remembers. An hour later, she stood once again in the Latimer drawing room, her delicate fingers tracing the air above the desk where the man had died. Pierce, red-faced and eager to please, pointed to the open casement. "It was here, ma'am. Found it on the carpet, gold with a green stone. Don't match any of Mr. Latimer's other cufflinks." Miss Marple leaned closer, peering at the small object lying in its evidence envelope. "A peridot, I believe, and the setting rather ornate. Not at all a man's style." She looked up. "Have you shown this to Mrs. Latimer?" "Yes, ma'am. Said she'd never seen it before." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And Miss Hartwell? Gone before we could ask her." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Then we must wonder whose it was, and who might be missing such an adornment." Her eyes flicked toward the window once more, lingering on the sill where faint smudges marked a disturbance. "Do you suppose, Constable, that anyone could have entered from the garden that night?" Pierce looked uncertain. "Difficult climb, ma'am, but maybe if they were tall enough." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Or if they had reason to be let in." When she left the house, her steps led her through the narrow lane toward the post office, where Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, was sorting letters with the self-importance of a woman who knew every secret in St. Mary Mead. "Morning, Miss Marple. Have you heard?" Evelyn Hartwell was seen at the station with a gentleman. "Not from around here, they say." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Really? How very interesting. Did anyone happen to mention what sort of gentleman?" Tall, dark-coat, foreign-sounding voice. "Carrying a briefcase. Some say he looked like a banker." Miss Marple thanked her and continued walking, her mind quietly knitting together threads that others saw only as frayed ends. A will leaving everything to the secretary. Her missing cufflink, clearly feminine. Her hasty departure with a stranger, and Mrs. Latimer's curious calmness. It all pointed somewhere, but where precisely she could not yet say. That evening she called upon Mrs. Latimer, bringing a small jar of quince jelly as a polite pretext. The widow received her in the drawing-room, pale but composed. "It's kind of you to come, Miss Marple," she said softly. "The house feels so empty now." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Yes, death does leave a most inconvenient sort of silence. And yet sometimes it also reveals things we were not meant to hear." The widow's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Only that I've often found the truth has a way of whispering to those who listen closely enough. For instance, I was told your husband's will surprised you." "It was absurd," Mrs. Latimer snapped before catching herself. "I mean, of course I was shocked." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "One always is when one's expectations are not met. But perhaps there is some mistake. Perhaps Miss Hartwell was not the intended heir after all." The woman's gaze flickered. "What do you mean?" "Merely that people sometimes alter their wills under influence. The kind one might not even notice at the time." She took a sip of tea, watching the widow over the rim of her cup. "You knew Miss Hartwell well, I take it?" A pause. "Not especially. How odd," Miss Marple said gently. "For she spoke very fondly of you in the grocer's only a week ago. Said she admired your composure." A flash of panic crossed the widow's face before she turned away. "She was kind, I'm sure." Miss Marple rose, setting her cup down with delicate precision. "Indeed. And I dare say she knew far more than she ever let on." When she stepped back into the cool evening air, the stars above the village seemed sharp as needles. She drew her shawl closer, her mind quietly turning. Someone in St. Mary Mead was lying, and soon, she thought, the silence surrounding Henry Latimer's death would begin to speak in earnest. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage, a breathless young Constable Pierce, hat in hand, his face red with excitement. "Miss Marple, Colonel Melrose sent me. There's been a development. They found Miss Hartwell's luggage at the station, left behind unopened." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "Left behind, you say? Oh dear. People in flight rarely forget their luggage unless they have no intention of collecting it." "That's just it," Pierce said. "The porter swears she boarded the late train with a man, but the luggage was never checked in, almost as if someone else meant to send it later." Miss Marple's eyes softened, thoughtful. "Or meant for us to believe she'd gone much farther than she had." She stood, laying aside her knitting with quiet precision. "Come along, Constable. Let's have a look at that luggage, shall we?" At the small, drafty station office, the trunk stood in a corner, its brown leather scuffed and tagged E. Hartwell, St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple bent over it, inspecting the lock. "Not forced," she murmured, "and no key attached. Curious." Pierce hesitated. "We were told not to open it yet, ma'am." "Oh, quite right," she said briskly. "But if you happen to have the Colonel's permission, strictly for identification, of course." Within minutes, the trunk was opened under the constable's supervision. Inside lay neatly folded clothes, a typewriter ribbon, and a bundle of letters tied with blue string. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the letters, neither love notes nor official correspondence, but something in between. She gently lifted the top one. The handwriting was Henry Latimer's. "My word," she whispered. "Not addressed, not posted. Drafts, perhaps. But why keep them?" She skimmed the first lines, her expression tightening. So our dear Mr. Latimer had more sentiment than sense. What do they say?" Pierce asked, craning his neck. "Nothing improper," Miss Marple replied, tucking the letter back carefully, "but enough to give the impression of intimacy to anyone less acquainted with his character. Tell me, Constable, who was it that suggested Mrs. Latimer not attend the inquest personally yesterday afternoon?" "Her friend, Mrs. Price, did, I think," Pierce said. "Said the shock was too much for her." "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple murmured. "Yes, I remember her. A talkative soul when there's mischief to be made." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Would you be so kind as to send word to Colonel Melrose? Tell him I should like a quiet word with Mrs. Price this afternoon." By 3 o'clock, Miss Marple was seated in Mrs. Price's sitting room, surrounded by lace doilies and the faint odor of lavender polish. Mrs. Price was, as expected, eager to talk. "Terrible business, dear Miss Marple, terrible. But you know, between ourselves, I never trusted that Miss Hartwell. Too quiet. The sort that hides things." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh yes, those who are quiet often notice much, don't they? Still, it must have been dreadful for poor Mrs. Latimer, with her husband so recently gone." Mrs. Price leaned forward conspiratorially. "We won't repeat it, of course, but she's not half so broken up as she pretends. I saw her out walking last night near the vicarage, quite composed, arm in arm with young Dr. Ellison. Said he was comforting her." Miss Marple's needles clicked together softly. "How very attentive of him. Though perhaps rather quick, don't you think, under the circumstances?" "Oh well," Mrs. Price sniffed. "Grief takes strange forms." "Indeed it does," Miss Marple murmured. "Sometimes gratitude looks remarkably like calculation." She rose, her expression serene. "Thank you, Mrs. Price. You've been most helpful, as always." As she walked home through the narrow lane, the afternoon light fell in slanted bars across the hedgerows, and her mind turned steadily over the new shape of things. A will leaving everything to a secretary who vanished. A trunk left behind with letters suggesting an affair. A widow whose composure slipped only when pressed. And now a doctor, clever, charming, and perhaps far too ready to comfort the bereaved. When Colonel Melrose joined her later that evening, she received him with tea and a satisfied little nod. "I think, Colonel," she began, "we have been looking at the wrong woman." He frowned. "You mean the widow isn't our suspect?" "Oh, she is involved, most certainly," Miss Marple said softly. "But not alone. You see, the true question is not who benefited from Mr. Latimer's death, but who thought they would, and found themselves mistaken." Melrose leaned forward. "Explain. Miss Hartwell's trunk was left behind, you say. Her will inheritance was never collected. Her sudden departure, her supposed lover at the station, all quite convenient if one wished to direct suspicion away from the true culprit. Consider, who would profit most from Miss Hartwell's death if she were thought guilty of Latimer's murder?" The Colonel blinked. "Mrs. Latimer, of course. Once suspicion shifts elsewhere, she inherits what's left uncontested." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. "But she could not have done it alone. The method, poison as the doctor so quickly diagnosed, required access and confidence. Someone who could procure and administer it unnoticed." The Colonel's eyes widened. "Good Lord, you mean Dr. Ellison?" "I mean," she said mildly, "that friendship between a widow and her late husband's physician is sometimes founded on mutual convenience rather than affection. The poor man likely thought himself very clever, until the letters in Miss Hartwell's trunk upset their tidy plan. Someone must have intercepted that luggage before it reached her, someone who wished to control what became of its contents." The Colonel stood pacing. "So you think Miss Hartwell never left St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think she may have left unwillingly, There is a pond behind Dr. Ellison's property, is there not? He stared. Good heavens, Miss Marple. Oh, don't look so alarmed, Colonel. It is only a thought, of course, but perhaps you might send a man to drag it quietly at dawn. Discretion, if you please. He swallowed hard, then nodded. I'll see to it. And if you're right— If I'm right, she said, returning to her knitting, we shall find that Miss Hartwell's silence was the final note in a duet, played by two rather foolish people who mistook cunning for cleverness. The fire crackled softly as Melrose took his leave, and Miss Marple sat alone once more, the rhythmic whisper of her needles blending with the ticking clock. Her gaze drifted toward the darkened lane beyond her window. Somewhere out there, she knew, truth waited beneath the surface, quiet, patient and ready to rise. At dawn, a pale mist crept across St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the cottages and hedgerows. The village was still, save for the quiet rustle of boots on damp grass near Dr. Ellison's property. Two constables, guided by Colonel Melrose himself, worked by the edge of the pond, grim-faced, their breath rising in clouds. Miss Marple stood a short distance away, shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, her expression one of quiet, mournful expectation. It did not take long. The dragline caught on something heavy beneath the surface, and when it rose dripping and slick with mud, a collective murmur rippled through the small group gathered there. What emerged was a woman's form, Miss Evelyn Hartwell, her pale face streaked with pondweed, her hand still clutching the remnant of a torn blue ribbon. Colonel Melrose turned sharply toward Miss Marple, his voice low. "Good God, woman, you were right." Miss Marple did not look triumphant. Instead, she sighed softly, her eyes full of sorrow. "Poor child," she murmured. She must have realized too late that she knew something she was never meant to know. As the constables lifted the body gently to the bank, Dr. Ellison appeared from his house, dressing gown hastily pulled over his clothes, his face pale with shock or what passed for it. "What's all this? What's happened?" The colonel's tone was grim. "We've found Miss Hartwell, Doctor. In your pond." Dr. Ellison's composure wavered. That's absurd. I haven't been near the pond in weeks." Miss Marple turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. "Then you must be the unluckiest man in all of England, Doctor. For it seems tragedy follows wherever you walk." He stiffened. "Are you implying—" "I imply nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "But facts do have a way of arranging themselves if one leaves them alone long enough. Mr. Latimer's sudden death, the disappearance of his secretary, your comforting attentions to the widow, each thing alone quite harmless. Yet when one looks at them together, they form a very neat picture. Mrs. Latimer arrived moments later, her cloak thrown loosely around her shoulders, her eyes wide with practiced disbelief. No, this can't be true," she cried. "Evelyn dead. Oh, how dreadful." Miss Marple watched her closely. The cry was almost perfect, the trembling voice nearly convincing. But grief, Miss Marple had long observed, seldom arrived on cue. "She drowned," the colonel said shortly. "Likely the night she disappeared. Her trunk was left behind. Perhaps she never made it to the station at all." Mrs. Latimer turned, appealing to Dr. Ellison. "You must tell them. You know I had nothing to do with this." Ellison hesitated, then stepped forward. "Of course not," he said quickly. "She was with me that evening. She came to my house for a consultation." "A migraine, wasn't it?" Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "Ah, yes, the convenient headache. So many women suffer them at the most opportune moments. And yet," she added softly, "I wonder what Miss Hartwell suffered, Doctor, when she stumbled upon your little conversation with Mrs. Latimer that night." His jaw tightened. "You're making wild assumptions, Miss Marple." "Oh, I never assume," she said, voice as mild as warm milk. "I simply notice. For example, your sleeve button. Missing, I think. The gold cufflink with the green peridot stone. It matches the one found in the dead man's study." He glanced instinctively at his wrist before catching himself. "That proves nothing. Anyone could—" "But not anyone would own such a distinctive piece," Miss Marple interrupted, her tone still kind, but her gaze unrelenting. "No, Doctor, the truth is simpler than we'd like. You visited Mr. Latimer that evening, perhaps under the pretext of checking on his health. You brought a sedative, one easily obtained in your profession. Mrs. Latimer waited nearby, perhaps in the garden, perhaps even in the study itself once it was done, and poor Miss Hartwell, faithful, loyal Evelyn, saw something she oughtn't have seen. That's why she was frightened enough to pack, yet too frightened to leave without her letters. Mrs. Latimer's voice cracked. "Stop it! You can't prove any of that!" Miss Marple's expression softened, but her voice carried a note of quiet finality. "My dear, I do not need to prove it. I need only to understand it. Proof, you see, is for the police." Colonel Melrose gestured to the constables. "You heard her. Keep an eye on both of them." But Miss Marple wasn't finished. "There is one last thing," she said, turning back toward the widow. "When I visited you 2 days ago, there was a faint scent of carbolic soap on your hands. Not unusual in itself, but rather strange for a lady who claims never to have entered her husband's study since his death. Carbolic, you see, is used by doctors and by those who have handled their instruments." Mrs. Latimer swayed slightly, her lips parting, and for a moment it seemed she might faint. Instead, she turned her gaze on Dr. Ellison, her voice trembling with fury. "You told me no one would ever find out. You said she'd gone away." Ellison's face drained of color. "You fool," he hissed under his breath. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, almost as if in prayer. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I do wish people wouldn't make promises they cannot keep. It so rarely ends well." When the constables led the pair away, the first rays of sunlight were beginning to burn away the mist. The pond lay still once more, its surface smooth, reflecting the pale sky above. Colonel Melrose turned to Miss Marple, shaking his head in awe. "How in the world did you see it all, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly, adjusting her shawl. "People, my dear Colonel, are much the same wherever you go. The clever ones always forget that others can think too. And the wicked, well, they never quite understand how very loud their silence can be." They walked back toward the lane together, the village beginning to stir around them, curtains opening, kettles whistling, a new day dawning as though nothing had happened at all. Miss Marple paused at her gate and looked once more toward the pond, her eyes thoughtful but not unkind. "In every village," she said softly, "there are secrets that sleep beneath the surface, but they never sleep forever." She stepped inside, closed her door gently, and took up her knitting again, the click of her needles blending with the distant church bells ringing over St. Mary Mead. The following days in St. Mary Mead carried a strange kind of stillness, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Word of the arrest spread quickly, winding through the lanes like smoke, reshaping every whispered conversation. Some pitied the widow. Others were horrified at the doctor's betrayal of trust, but nearly all agreed that Miss Marple had once again seen straight through the polite disguises of human decency. Yet for all the village chatter, Miss Marple herself seemed curiously preoccupied. She went about her usual errands, the post office, the grocer's, the vicarage, with her calm composure intact, but her eyes remained thoughtful. There was something unfinished, a loose thread in the tapestry that troubled her mind. It was 3 days after the arrests when Colonel Melrose came calling again, his expression both relieved and puzzled. "The confession's been signed," he announced as she poured his tea. "Mrs. Latimer broke down completely this morning. Said it was the doctor's idea, that he poisoned Latimer and made her help move the body to stage it as suicide. Claims she was terrified of him. I dare say it fits well enough." Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately. "Yes," she said softly. "It fits perhaps a little too neatly." He frowned. "You think she's lying?" "Not entirely," Miss Marple replied, folding her hands. "There is truth in what she says, but I believe she has embroidered it to her advantage. You see, guilt often arranges itself for comfort. One always prefers to picture oneself as the victim, not the architect." Melrose sighed. "Well, between the poison, the cufflink, and her outburst that morning, I'd say we've enough to hang them both if need be. What more could there be?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the hearth, where the fire glowed low and steady. "Only this, Colonel. Why was the will drawn up in Miss Hartwell's favor at all?" He blinked. "Because Latimer was infatuated with her." "Oh no," Miss Marple said gently. "You see, Henry Latimer was many things, vain, pompous, perhaps too fond of admiration, but he was not a fool. He may have flirted with the girl, yes, but he would never disinherit his wife for a secretary. That will was meant for someone else's advantage, not his own." Melrose's brow furrowed as realization began to dawn. "You think they forged it?" "Not forged, no. Persuaded," she corrected quietly. "I dare say Dr. Ellison convinced him to make some temporary arrangement, under the pretext of tax management or charitable donation. Once signed, it was quite simple to adjust the names afterward, especially with Miss Hartwell's typewriter conveniently at hand. But Latimer must have discovered it, and that dear Colonel is why he died. Melrose exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. Good Lord, the man was cleverer than we gave him credit for. Cleverness, Miss Marple said, smiling faintly, is a dangerous thing in wicked hands. It always collapses under its own vanity. She set down her cup and looked up at him. Tell me, did Mrs. Latimer confess to knowing about the letters in Miss Hartwell's trunk? He looked surprised. No, she didn't mention them. Then perhaps you should ask her again, Miss Marple said softly, because I rather think she knew exactly what those letters were and feared their discovery far more than her husband's death. Later that afternoon, Melrose followed her advice. By evening he was back at her cottage, his expression grave. You were right again. She admitted it. Said she found the letters in Evelyn's desk the morning after Latimer died. They weren't love letters at all. Drafts of legal notes he'd dictated about investments, property transfers, the sort of thing that could unravel the will entirely. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Poor Evelyn kept them as proof, perhaps suspecting something was amiss, and when she confronted the doctor or the widow, whichever came first, she signed her own death warrant. It was not jealousy that killed her, Colonel. It was practicality. He stared into the fire for a long moment. You make it sound so ordinary. It always is, Miss Marple said quietly. Murder rarely springs from passion, not in villages like ours. Here it's born from the small respectable motives, greed, embarrassment, fear of scandal. The world would be a much safer place if people only realized how dull sin really is. Melrose gave a short, rueful laugh. You do have a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. I sometimes wonder how you sleep at night with all that knowledge rattling in your head. Oh, quite well, she said, smiling. A clear conscience and a bit of warm milk will do wonders. Besides, I have my knitting to occupy me. One must always keep one's hands busy, even when the mind is wandering through darker places. The following morning, the newspapers arrived with their grim headlines. Village doctor and widow confess to shocking crime, and the postmistress, Mrs. Weatherby, could hardly contain herself with excitement. I always said that doctor was too smooth by half, she told anyone who would listen. But to think of poor Miss Hartwell, drowned like that, it's dreadful. Miss Marple only smiled faintly as she collected her letters, her mind already moving elsewhere. Justice, she reflected, was rarely tidy, but it did have a way of setting things to rights. And in St. Mary Mead, life resumed its quiet rhythm, as it always did, teapots clinking, church bells ringing, gossip rippling gently through the hedgerows. Yet that evening, when she sat by the fire with her knitting, Miss Marple allowed herself one small sigh. She thought of Evelyn Hartwell, clever, capable, kind, and of how very easily goodness was mistaken for weakness. People like Evelyn never fought for themselves, she mused. They simply trusted that decency would be enough to protect them. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. Poor girl, she murmured. She trusted in silence, and silence in the end betrayed her. Outside, the last traces of sunset faded beyond the trees, and the village settled once more into its quiet slumber. But inside the cottage, beneath the steady glow of the lamp, Miss Marple's needles clicked in perfect rhythm, steady, patient, and certain, weaving yet another thread into the great tapestry of human folly she understood so very well. The following week brought rain, steady, silver sheets of it that softened the edges of St. Mary Mead and turned the lanes to ribbons of mud. Miss Marple, however, was untroubled by weather. She moved through her small routines as if nothing in the world could disturb her calm. But beneath that mild exterior, her thoughts worked with the quiet precision of a clock's inner gears. Something about the case still stirred uneasily in her mind, something that refused to fit neatly into the picture that everyone else had accepted. It was a small thing that revived her unease. While visiting the vicar's wife to deliver a jar of marmalade, Miss Marple happened to overhear a conversation between Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Weatherby. Such a pity about that poor girl, Evelyn Hartwell, Mrs. Price Ridley was saying. They say she wrote to her cousin in London before she died. A dreadful letter, apparently. They've kept it sealed as evidence. Miss Marple paused with her teacup halfway to her lips. A letter? It had not been mentioned in the police reports. She smiled politely, made her excuses, and later that afternoon sent a quiet note to Colonel Melrose asking whether he might stop by for tea. He arrived at dusk, dripping from the rain and looking faintly amused. "You've an uncanny way of summoning me just when I think we're done," he said, shaking the water from his hat. "Curiosity, my dear Colonel," Miss Marple replied with a kind twinkle. "It's a dreadful affliction. Now tell me, did Miss Hartwell write to anyone before she died?" Melrose hesitated. "As a matter of fact, she did. A letter to a cousin in London. We intercepted it through the postal records after the arrest. It's still sealed, part of the official evidence." "Why?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Because, Colonel, I think that letter may not be what you believe." "May I see it?" He studied her face for a long moment, then sighed. "You know, if it were anyone else asking, I'd say absolutely not. But you've earned a few exceptions." The following morning he returned with the letter, an envelope slightly water-stained but intact, addressed in Evelyn Hartwell's delicate handwriting. Miss Marple examined it carefully, her expression unreadable. "Interesting," she murmured. "You see the crease here at the edge of the flap? That's not from sealing, it's from resealing. And the ink on the address is fractionally darker than the stamp mark. Someone opened this after it was written." Melrose frowned. "You're saying the doctor intercepted it?" "Perhaps. Or someone else." She turned the letter over in her hands, then looked up. "Do you recall who delivered it to the post?" "The innkeeper's boy, wasn't it?" He nodded. "Yes, young Tommy Briggs." "Then I should like a word with Tommy, if you don't mind." It didn't take long to find him. A shy, freckled boy with nervous eyes, standing in the drizzle behind the post office. When Miss Marple spoke to him gently, his shoulders relaxed. "I didn't mean no harm, miss," he said. "It were Mrs. Latimer who gave me the letter. Said Miss Hartwell wanted it sent off quick-like, but not to tell anyone. Only she'd already opened it. I saw the flap bent up. She slipped something inside before handing it to me." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind sharpened instantly. "You've been very brave to tell me, Tommy. I'll see that no trouble comes to you." Back at her cottage, she relayed the news to Colonel Melrose, who stood silent for a long time, staring at the rain streaking the window pane. So the widow tampered with the letter. But why? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. To alter what Evelyn had written. "You see, Evelyn wasn't writing to her cousin at all, I suspect. She was writing to you." "To me?" He turned startled. "Yes, she trusted you, Colonel. She meant to confess that she had uncovered something about the doctor and Mrs. Latimer, something she couldn't quite prove, but feared was deadly. But the widow intercepted it, perhaps even with the doctor's help, and inserted a note of her own, making it appear as though Evelyn's letter was nothing but a personal farewell. A clever way to silence suspicion, while ensuring Evelyn's words could never be used against them. Melrose sat heavily in the armchair, so even her last attempt to speak the truth was smothered. Miss Marple looked into the fire, her face unreadable. "Yes, but I believe the truth finds its way, even when men and women do their best to bury it." There was silence for a while, the quiet kind that feels almost alive, filled with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Then she rose, took the letter from its envelope, and tilted it gently toward the firelight. Beneath the layer of paper, faint indentations revealed themselves, ghostly impressions of words that had once been written and erased. She fetched a pencil and lightly shaded the paper's surface. As the graphite dust settled, lines began to emerge, broken sentences, trembling loops of inkless thought. "If something happens to me, tell Colonel Melrose. The doctor isn't what he seems. I have proof in the blue envelope." "Under the clock," Melrose's breath caught. "Good Lord!" "The blue envelope," Miss Marple said softly. "Did you ever find one?" He shook his head. "No, we searched her room twice." "Then you searched too obviously," Miss Marple said. "A frightened woman hides things as though the world itself were watching. I imagine Miss Hartwell tucked it somewhere no one would think to look." Her eyes glinted. "Perhaps I should pay her room one last visit." That evening, under Melrose's quiet escort, she returned to the Hartwell lodgings above the draper's shop. The room was just as it had been left, neat, spare, touched with a kind of timid grace. Miss Marple walked slowly about, her fingers brushing the small ornaments, her gaze drawn to the clock on the mantelpiece. She lifted it carefully, turned it over, and there, taped beneath the wooden base, was a thin blue envelope. Inside lay several sheets of paper, neatly folded. They were receipts, payments from Dr. Ellison's private account to a chemist in Bath, the same one that supplied the poison found in Latimer's body. Dates, signatures, even amounts, everything laid bare. Miss Marple handed them to the Colonel with a faint, satisfied smile. There, you see. The dead do speak, if only one listens closely enough. Melrose looked at her in astonishment. You've done it again. This proves premeditation beyond doubt. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her tone remained measured. No, Colonel. Evelyn has done it. I merely helped her voice be heard. The clock ticked softly in the silence of Miss Marple's sitting room, its measured rhythm seeming to echo the calm certainty that had settled over her mind. Colonel Melrose sat across from her, the blue envelope resting on the table between them like a quiet confession. The proof it contained had unraveled much of the confusion surrounding the murder. Yet Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as if still listening to an inner whisper that had not quite faded. The chemist in Bath, Melrose said at last, breaking the hush. He's confirmed the handwriting on those receipts. The doctor signed for the poison himself, over several weeks. There's no question now of accident or coincidence. Miss Marple nodded. No, indeed. But it is curious, isn't it, that a man as cautious as Dr. Ellison should leave such evidence trailing behind him. He must have been confident no one would ever think to connect the dots. That sort of arrogance is rather common among clever men who underestimate human curiosity, particularly that of women. Melrose gave a short laugh. You mean you, of course. I mean all of us, she replied mildly. Evelyn Hartwell saw something she wasn't meant to see. I suspect she began to notice inconsistencies, perhaps the way the widow Latimer's illness lingered too conveniently, or how Dr. Ellison made a habit of visiting her even after her husband's death. A woman's intuition, you see, is a most inconvenient thing when men think themselves subtle. Melrose leaned forward. And Mrs. Latimer? What of her? Was she complicit or merely his puppet? Miss Marple smiled faintly, the kind that carried no joy. Ah, that is the final question, isn't it? The poor widow, outwardly meek, inwardly seething with resentment toward a husband who controlled every penny she touched. Dr. Ellison offered her sympathy, perhaps even affection, and a way out. But such partnerships rarely last. When a murder is shared, it becomes a chain that binds its partners together in fear, not love. Melrose frowned. So you believe she helped him kill her husband? Oh, yes, said Miss Marple softly. But what she did not foresee was that the good doctor's ambition would not stop there. Evelyn's death was his doing alone. He feared she might speak, and that Mrs. Latimer's conscience, so recently awakened, might follow. You see, Colonel, guilt changes people. It makes them unpredictable. Melrose nodded slowly. He's still at his house under watch. We'll arrest him at dawn. Miss Marple gave a small nod, though her eyes strayed to the window where the rain had finally ceased. Be careful, Colonel. He is cornered, and cornered men sometimes strike before they fall. Her warning proved wise. That night, before the arrest could be carried out, Dr. Ellison attempted to flee the village. He was caught on the North Road, his motor car half submerged in a ditch, his expression blank and weary. When Melrose confronted him with the receipts and the blue envelope, Ellison said only, she never should have written that letter. The next morning, the entire village buzzed like a disturbed hive. Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Weatherby, the vicar's wife, each had her own theory about the doctor's motives, none close to the truth. Mrs. Latimer locked herself in her cottage, refusing to see anyone. By afternoon, Miss Marple decided it was time for one last conversation. She called upon Mrs. Latimer, who answered the door pale and trembling, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. I thought they'd come for me, she whispered. They may yet, Miss Marple replied gently. But it isn't too late to tell the truth, my dear. Not to the police, but to yourself. I know what you did and what you didn't do. Mrs. Latimer sank into a chair, her voice breaking. He told me it would be quick. He said no one would ever know. I didn't mean to hurt Evelyn. I only wanted peace. Miss Marple's gaze was soft but unyielding. Peace built on another's suffering is never truly peace. It is only a pause before the storm. I think Evelyn understood that. She tried to protect you even as she faced her own fear. The widow began to weep silently, and Miss Marple rose, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. The law will do what it must, she said, but conscience has its own way of judging us. Do what little good you can now. It is all any of us can do. When Miss Marple left the cottage, the air felt clearer, as though the storm that had hovered over St. Mary Mead for weeks had finally passed. She walked slowly home, nodding to neighbours who peered curiously from behind their curtains. The village, she knew, would soon settle back into its comfortable rhythm. Teas, garden clubs, whispered gossip, but beneath it all lingered that familiar truth. Even in the gentlest places, darkness found its way in. That evening, Colonel Melrose stopped by one final time. "Ellison confessed this morning," he told her quietly. "Everything. The poison, the forged prescriptions, even Evelyn's death. He said you'd already known even before he did." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not before him, perhaps, but I did recognize the signs. When one lives long enough, Colonel, one sees patterns repeat themselves. Envy, fear, love turn to resentment. Murder rarely begins with violence. It begins with wounded pride." Melrose looked at her thoughtfully. "And what will you do now, Miss Marple?" "Oh, much the same as before," she said, resuming her knitting. "The world may change around us, but human nature never does. There will always be another puzzle, another small deceit waiting to bloom into tragedy. I'll keep my eyes open, and my tea warm." The clock chimed softly in the corner, the fire crackled, and for a brief moment the house felt utterly at peace. Outside, the village lights glimmered like watchful eyes over the quiet streets. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her needles moving in a steady rhythm. "The murder that slept in silence," she murmured. "And now perhaps it may finally rest." For several days, St. Mary Mead seemed to breathe again. The grey clouds that had lingered for weeks finally gave way to sunlight, washing the village lanes and gardens in a soft, golden calm. The chatter at the grocer's returned to its usual hum: prices, recipes, the vicar's latest sermon. But beneath it all, the faint pulse of gossip still thrummed. Dr. Ellison's name was whispered, with a strange blend of disbelief and grim satisfaction, while Mrs. Latimer's house stood quiet, its curtains forever drawn. Miss Marple, though outwardly untroubled, felt the weight of unfinished thoughts pressing gently at the back of her mind. There was something about the case that hadn't quite rested, something elusive that stirred in the quiet hours when she sat alone by her fire. It wasn't doubt, she never doubted the facts, but a kind of melancholy curiosity, the lingering question of why people chose deceit when honesty might have saved them all so much pain. One evening, as twilight deepened, she received an unexpected visitor. Reverend Clement appeared at her door, hat in hand, his kind face marked with concern. "My dear Miss Marple," he began, stepping inside, "I've just come from the rectory. Mrs. Latimer has requested to see you. She's been quite unwell since the arrest, and I think she's near the end of her strength." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I see," she said quietly, setting aside her knitting. "Then it's best not to delay." They walked together through the fading light, the village hushed except for the rustle of leaves and the faint chiming of a distant clock. When they reached the small cottage, the air inside was heavy with stillness. Mrs. Latimer sat in her armchair by the window, her hands clasped in her lap, her face pale but oddly peaceful. "I knew you'd come," she murmured, her voice faint but steady. "There's something I must tell you before they take me away. It's not confession I seek, only understanding." Miss Marple seated herself opposite, her manner gentle and patient. "Then tell me, my dear. Sometimes truth spoken aloud is the only balm left." Mrs. Latimer took a shuddering breath. "When my husband died, I felt nothing. No grief, no relief, only emptiness. Dr. Ellison filled that emptiness. He was kind at first, or seemed so. He told me I deserved better, that he could make things right. But I didn't know he meant murder, not until the night it happened." Her eyes filled with tears that did not fall. "He said it was for us, that we'd start anew. But afterward he changed. He watched me like a hawk, controlled every word I spoke. When Evelyn grew suspicious, he panicked. He said she'd ruin everything. I tried to warn her, I truly did. That letter, she gave it to me to post, but I couldn't let it go. I thought I was protecting him, protecting us." Miss Marple's gaze was tender yet resolute. "And so you altered it?" "Yes," the widow whispered. "I burned her words and wrote my own. I told myself it was mercy, but it was fear. Fear of being alone again, fear of facing what I'd become. He killed her that same night. When I saw her name in the paper, I knew it was my doing as much as his. Silence filled the room, the kind that carried both judgment and forgiveness. Miss Marple reached out, resting a hand over the woman's trembling fingers. Guilt is a heavy companion, Mrs. Latimer. It never leaves, but it does grow quieter if one faces it honestly. I believe deep down you already have. Mrs. Latimer's lips quivered in a faint, sorrowful smile. Do you think God will forgive me? I believe he understands, Miss Marple said softly. We are all of us weaker than we wish to be and stronger than we think. You have chosen truth now, that is a beginning. When Miss Marple left the cottage, the moon had risen pale over the rooftops. The Reverend lingered at the gate, his breath visible in the cool night air. Will she be all right? He asked quietly. She won't see another winter, Miss Marple replied gently, but perhaps that is mercy too. They parted in silence, and Miss Marple made her way home along the narrow lane. The houses glowed faintly like lanterns in the dark, and she found herself reflecting on the strange constancy of human nature, the way love could twist into cruelty, and guilt could in time soften back into grace. A few days later, a letter arrived from Colonel Melrose. Dr. Ellison had been transferred to London for trial, but he had refused to speak again after his confession. His silence, Miss Marple thought, was a fitting punishment. Words, after all, had been his undoing. His false reassurances, his careful lies, his manipulations spoken in the guise of kindness. That afternoon, she sat in her garden with her tea, watching the sparrows flutter among the hedges. The village carried on as always. Mrs. Price Ridley gossiping with renewed vigor, young Tommy Briggs cycling down the lane, the vicar's wife waving cheerfully from across the way. The world, it seemed, had righted itself once more. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath every placid surface, shadows lingered, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Humanity, she mused, was rather like her rose bushes, beautiful to behold, yet prickly beneath the bloom. As the clock struck 6, she set down her cup and resumed her knitting. Her fingers moved deftly, the rhythmic click of needles blending with the faint murmur of life outside. The pattern was nearly complete, and in its quiet symmetry she found comfort. For all its flaws and cruelties, the world still followed its pattern too, a pattern she could read as easily as any piece of wool. The sun dipped low, and a thin smile crossed her face. It never truly ends, does it? She murmured to herself. One murder sleeps, another stirs. But human hearts, they're the same, always the same. And with that quiet reflection, Miss Marple continued her work, the evening settling softly around her cottage. Has St. Mary Mead, ever timeless, drifted once more into peaceful silence?